December 11, 1978, 11:05 p.m. inside the Lufthansa cargo building at John F. Kennedy International Airport, was the moment that changed everything, as heavily armed men burst through the doors, taking control of the area with ruthless efficiency. They were there for one reason: to get their hands on the millions of dollars in cash and jewels that had been loaded onto a cargo plane just hours before. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night air as the thieves moved room to room, taking down anyone who got in their way. It was a night that would go down in history as one of the most brazen heists ever pulled off in the United States. The Lufthansa heist would yield a staggering $5.875 million, making it the largest cash robbery committed in the U.S. at the time. The scene inside the Lufthansa cargo building was one of chaos and terror, as the thieves moved quickly and decisively, raking the area with gunfire and taking down anyone who dared to stand in their way. The building was a large, dimly lit space filled with rows of shipping containers, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel and the sound of gunfire echoing off the walls. As the thieves moved through the area, they smashed through walls and windows, creating a path of destruction in their wake. The night was cold and dark, the only sound the steady beat of gunfire and the distant hum of airport traffic. It was a scene that would haunt the memories of those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. At the center of it all was James Burke, a notorious associate of the Lucchese crime family, who was said to have masterminded the entire operation. Burke was a cunning and ruthless individual, with a reputation for being willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. He was the mastermind behind one of the most daring heists in U.S. history, and his involvement would go on to have far-reaching consequences. But who was James Burke, and what drove him to pull off such a brazen crime? As we dig into the story of the Lufthansa heist, we'll be looking at the events that led up to this night of chaos and destruction. As the thieves made their escape, witnesses described the sound of gunfire and the sight of men running wildly through the airport, their faces obscured by ski masks. Some described hearing the sound of men being shot and killed, while others spoke of seeing the thieves making off with large sacks of cash and jewelry. The night was a blur of chaos and confusion, as the full extent of the robbery was not immediately clear. It would take days for the airport to begin to recover from the shock of the robbery, and weeks for the police to piece together the events of that fateful night. As the news of the heist spread, the world was left to wonder how such a brazen crime could have been pulled off right under the noses of airport security. James Burke was the central person in this case, a man with a reputation in the world of organized crime as an associate of the Lucchese crime family of New York City, estimated to be around 45 years old at the time of the Lufthansa heist in 1978. Burke was born in New York City, and had spent most of his life there, growing up in a family that was involved in various forms of crime. Burke's life was characterized by a complex mix of charm, violence, and ruthlessness. His association with the Lucchese crime family provided him with power and influence in the city's underworld. Burke was known for his involvement in various illicit activities, including extortion and loan sharking. Despite his involvement in organized crime, Burke's daily life seemed ordinary enough, at least on the surface. He had a wife and children, and was known to be a devoted family man. Burke was also known to be fiercely loyal to those he considered friends, and would stop at nothing to protect them. However, his loyalty was often balanced by a ruthless willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in his way or threatened his interests. Burke's personality was marked by a confident air of authority, and he was widely respected by those who knew him. What made Burke likable was the charisma and charm he possessed, traits that made him highly relatable and sympathetic to those who knew him. His involvement in organized crime was seen by many as a means to an end, a way to provide for his family and secure their future. This perception of Burke as a family man and provider helped to soften the edges of his rough exterior. However, this perception was not without its flaws, and Burke's true nature would eventually be revealed. The public's perception of Burke was influenced by the myth that he was a made man in the Lucchese crime family. Burke's relationships were complex and multifaceted, involving numerous associates and family members. He trusted a select few, including his close associates and family members, but was notorious for his willingness to betray those who had wronged him. Burke's relationships were also marked by a deep-seated loyalty to the Lucchese crime family, and he would stop at nothing to protect its interests. However, Burke's trust in others was not always blind, and he was known to be calculating and ruthless in his pursuit of power and wealth. Burke's relationships were ultimately shaped by his own interests and motivations. The months leading up to the incident were marked by intense planning and preparation, as Burke and his associates made final preparations for the heist. Burke's life was marked by a sense of anticipation and excitement, as he worked tirelessly to bring the heist to fruition. His associates were sworn to secrecy, and were aware of the gravity of their involvement in the heist. However, whispers of the heist's magnitude began to spread, and some began to realize the true scope of Burke's plans. The tension leading up to the heist was palpable, and it was clear that Burke and his associates were on the cusp of something big. The first warning signs that something was wrong came when airport workers began to talk about the large amounts of cash being flown in by Lufthansa. Werner, the airport worker, had inadvertently provided Burke with valuable information about the airline's cargo shipments. However, Werner's involvement in the heist remained a secret, even to those closest to him. The whispers of the heist's magnitude began to spread, and some began to wonder if Burke's plans could possibly go ahead. However, Burke's reputation and influence in the world of organized crime meant that few dared to question him. Burke's associates were well aware of the gravity of their involvement, and some began to voice concerns about the heist's feasibility. However, Burke's leadership and charisma were enough to silence their doubts, and the heist was set in motion. Werner was tasked with providing the inside information, and Burke's associates were sworn to secrecy. However, Werner's involvement in the heist would ultimately prove to be his downfall. The heist was set for December 11, 1978, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. As the days leading up to the heist ticked by, tensions mounted, and some began to feel a sense of unease. Werner was aware of the gravity of his involvement, and some of his colleagues began to suspect him of being involved in something sinister. However, Werner's involvement in the heist remained a secret, even to those closest to him. The Lufthansa heist was set to be the largest cash robbery in U.S. history, and Burke's involvement in it would change the course of his life forever. The question on everyone's lips was, would Burke succeed in pulling off the heist of the century? On the morning of December 11, 1978, at approximately 3 a.m., a cold winter night at John F. Kennedy International Airport, in New York City, a black Ford Econoline van carrying 6 men pulled up to Building 261, Lufthansa's cargo terminal. The crew consisted of Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Louis Cafra, Joe Manri, Paolo Licastri, and Robert McMahon, all led by James Burke's associates, who had planned this daring heist. The men were dressed in black and wore gloves to conceal their fingerprints. Snowflakes gently fell onto the terminal's parking lot, but the crew had no time to notice the serene winter scene. The air was crisp, with a hint of diesel fuel and the distant hum of the airport's operations. It all started with a tip from bookmaker Martin Krugman, who told Henry Hill about Lufthansa's cargo terminal at JFK. Hill then relayed this information to James Burke, who began planning the heist. Burke's associate, Louis Werner, an airport worker with a history of theft, provided crucial information about Lufthansa's cargo operations. Werner, along with his co-worker Peter Grunwald, had previously stolen $22,000 in foreign currency from Lufthansa. The crew had been working on the heist for months, studying the airport's layout and timing their approach for the early morning hours when the terminal would be least busy. The crew sprang into action, swiftly carrying out their plan. Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe entered the building, while Louis Cafra, Joe Manri, and Paolo Licastri waited outside, acting as lookouts. The men quickly overwhelmed the security guards, binding them with duct tape to silence their cries for help. Robert McMahon began loading the stolen cash and jewels into duffel bags, while DeSimone and Sepe searched for more valuable items to grab. The heist moved with precision, with the crew working together to maximize their haul. As the crew fled the scene, they left behind a chaotic mess and a security guard, Joe "Papa" DiNapoli, who stumbled upon the carnage. DiNapoli discovered the bound and gagged security guards, the shattered glass from the terminal's windows, and the scattered cash and jewels. The sheer scale of the heist was staggering. An estimated $5.875 million in cash and jewels had been stolen, making it the largest cash robbery committed in the U.S. at the time. DiNapoli's eyes widened in shock as he realized the enormity of the crime. The police first responded to the Lufthansa heist at around 3:40 a.m. on December 11, 1978, when a security guard in Building 261, the cargo terminal, called the police to report a van had smashed through the airport's perimeter fence. The police quickly arrived at the scene, but by then, the thieves had already stolen an estimated $5.875 million. The investigation that followed was one of the largest and most complex in New York City's history, involving teams of detectives and forensic experts. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the heist would be difficult to crack. The key piece of evidence that changed everything in the Lufthansa heist investigation was a security video that showed the getaway van crashing through the airport perimeter fence. The video was grainy, but it provided a crucial clue for the police: the number plate of the van was partially visible. With the number plate, the police were able to track down the van and eventually, the people who had rented it. The investigators also discovered that the van had been rented by an individual who turned out to be a relative of one of the main suspects. The breakthrough came when the police finally identified the person who rented the van. The main suspects in the Lufthansa heist were several associates of the Lucchese crime family, including James Burke, the alleged mastermind of the robbery. Burke's associates, including Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Louis Caffra, Joe Manri, Paolo Licastri, and Robert McMahon, were also under suspicion. Additionally, the airport worker Louis Werner was implicated in the planning of the heist. Werner was eventually convicted and served time for his role in the robbery. However, despite the numerous arrests and convictions, the mastermind behind the Lufthansa heist was never officially charged. The red herring that wasted months of investigation in the Lufthansa heist case was the identification of the wrong suspect, who was later cleared of charges. This suspect, a relative of a Lucchese associate, had rented a car near the airport on the night of the heist, but he had no other connection to the crime. The police spent months investigating and building a case against the suspect, only to have him cleared of charges when new evidence came to light. The wasted time and resources were a significant setback for the investigation. As the investigation continued, the police and FBI focused on other leads, including the Lucchese crime family's associates. The twist or revelation nobody predicted was that James Burke, the Lucchese crime family associate widely believed to be the mastermind behind the Lufthansa heist, was never officially charged in connection with the crime. Despite being the prime suspect, Burke was never brought to trial or convicted in the Lufthansa heist. This lack of accountability was likely due to Burke's powerful connections within the Lucchese crime family. It's also worth noting that Burke's reputation as a ruthless and cunning crime boss made it difficult for investigators to gather evidence against him. In the end, the lack of charges leveled against Burke only added to the mystique surrounding his involvement in the heist. The reason for Burke's immunity remains a topic of debate, with many speculating that it was due to his close ties with high-ranking members of the Lucchese crime family, including the notorious Tommy Gambino, who served as the family's underboss. Others argue that Burke's connections to the NYPD, specifically the corrupt detectives who were on